So I'm recording this on July 21st in the morning, just in case any news breaks out. On this episode of the Athletic Acuity Sports Podcast, kind of a special episode, going to be previewing the NHL series that are going to start soon, as well as the entire NHL Playoff Tournament. I'll be going over each of the 5-game series, the play-in series, and after that I'll go over some pieces of information about each of the 4 top teams in each conference that got a bye out of these play-in series. It's a pretty exciting time right now to get playoff hockey back for the NHL. I don't necessarily think that this tournament format is something we should do every year, but I think just considering the circumstances of this year, it's pretty cool. I think it's cool to have all of these different teams, a lot of, whom we're not anticipating having a chance to get a chance here to play in for the playoffs. Kind of an exciting 5-game series format here. So without further ado, I'll get into it. Pittsburgh and Montreal. So the Penguins are favored by quite a bit in most places. I don't really see a betting advantage here. I think Pittsburgh, I'd be pretty surprised if they didn't win this series. Going over some notes with Pittsburgh here, Evgeny Malkin actually was having a tremendous season before the season stopped. He had 74 points in only 55 games played, a 1.35 points per game, which was, not too far away from some of the elite players in the league. Pretty darn good season for Malkin, who has just continued to be amazing throughout his career. This Pittsburgh D-core is something I was looking kind of closely at to see if this team could really contend for a cup this year or whether they're kind of going through a transition. A couple of maybe noteworthy guys that have made good impacts for them have been John Marino and Marcus Pettersson. To go along with that, they've kept some of their horses, Chris Letang, Dumoulin. Schultz has declined a little bit, but he's still there. I think the biggest storyline with Pittsburgh going into this tournament is the goaltending, because Matt Murray, who has won 2 Stanley Cups and was really amazing in several of the series in both of those cup runs, has, at least was having a really poor season before it stopped. In 38 games played, only an .899 save percentage. On the flip side, they've got Tristan Jarry, who stepped in 33 games, a .921 save percentage. So I think ultimately one of these 2 guys is going to be good enough for Pittsburgh to win this play-in series, but in terms of them moving forward, after the play-in series, I don't know if this is actually a cup contender. I think that they've got an outside shot at it, and I don't want to doubt them because they've got so many guys with experience, and Matt Murray has stolen some series in the past, so I don't want to put it past him to do it again, but this is kind of a dilemma for them. They're only going to get 5 games in the play-in series to figure out which goalie to go with. I think the stoppage probably helps Murray because, he seems to be kind of a streaky goalie where he's either pretty great or not so great, so we'll see what ends up happening. I'll be curious to see who they start in the first game. But yeah, Pittsburgh ultimately, I think, is an intriguing team that has an outside shot at going pretty far in this whole, Stanley Cup playoffs. But there are some other teams in the Eastern Conference I like a little bit more than them right now. On the flip side, we have Montreal, who is the 12th seed. So a lot of people at the very beginning, when this format was first announced, were kind of talking about how this was really bad for Pittsburgh because the Penguins have to deal with Carey Price. You can call me crazy. I don't think Carey Price is the same guy that Carey Price was maybe 5 years ago. To me, Carey Price is actually just an average goalie right now. He's 32 years old. I'm just going to go over his last 3 seasons. In the 2017-2018 season, he played in 49 games. He had a .900 save percentage, which is pretty weak. In 2018-2019, 66 games, a .918 save percentage, quite a bit better. And then in the 2019-2020 season, before it stopped, in 58 games, just a .909 save percentage. In that time span of those 3 years, his record in the regular season, 78, 75, and 19. All due respect to Carey Price, he's had a really good career. But in the past 3 years, those numbers, are pretty much average. And I know that the Canadiens haven't had a great roster around him. Part of the reason why is because Price makes so much money, and it's tough to build around a goalie and put together a Stanley Cup team. I will also mention that, some of these teams are probably going to have their eyes on the first overall pick, which is kind of an interesting wrinkle to throw into this. Montreal could really benefit from Lafreniere, and, they've needed scoring, and a playmaking center would definitely help them out. Some of their better prospects going into this year seemingly have had some difficult times lately, specifically Ryan Poehling and Jesperi Kotkaniemi both took big steps backward this year. So, just going back to this play-in series, Pittsburgh is heavily favored. I think Pittsburgh will pull this out. I think Montreal is going through a pretty big transition here. Not enough scoring, not enough defensive depth. It is surprising to me how Shea Weber has actually, performed better later in his career than Subban has. Back when that trade happened, there were a lot of, negative comments towards Montreal. I think that they ended up winning that deal. But ultimately, I don't think the Canadiens have enough depth to pull this off. And I don't think Carey Price is who he used to be. If Carey Price were the Carey Price from 5 years ago, I'd say, yeah, that guy could steal a 5-game series. But the Carey Price today, probably not. It's also important to mention that the head-to-head season series between these two teams, Pittsburgh was 2-1-0 against Montreal. Montreal 1-1-1 against Pittsburgh. So pretty even. Pittsburgh did have a slight edge. All right, moving to Toronto and Columbus. So Toronto is favored pretty heavily, not as heavily as Pittsburgh was against Montreal. Toronto 1-0-1 against Columbus before the season stopped. Columbus 1-1-0 against Toronto. So pretty even there. Each team took one win against the other. This is another big obstacle and test for the Toronto Maple Leafs. They were teetering on maybe making the playoffs, maybe not when the season stopped. There's always a lot of pressure on this team to perform well. The Maple Leafs do have a lot more skill than the Blue Jackets do. Just going over some of their offensive players, of course, Austin Matthews was having a terrific season before it stopped. Nylander was having a really good season. Marner has been just really consistent, kind of quietly. Tavares is a good piece to have as well. Going along with that, the Leafs actually, I think, have a decor with some potential. I think Morgan Rielly, you could make the argument, is one of the 5 best defensemen in the NHL. I think he's in contention for that. Jake Muzzin is super solid. Tyson Barrie started playing a lot better, being used better when the coaching change happened. So, he's a good contributor. Some other guys that are kind of background defensemen for them for now. Justin Holl quietly was playing pretty well this year. And Rasmus Sandin is someone who I like a lot. Very young right now. I don't know if he's actually going to be a difference maker for now, but in 2 or 3 years from now, I could see him being a top pair type of defenseman for this team. And the Leafs have a lot of secondary scoring. Kapanen, Andreas Janssen, Mikheyev is going to get a chance to play. He's probably healed from his injury. Alexander Kerfoot. I think this team is really well put together. I trust Frederik Andersen. I think he's a pretty good player still. And, going to Columbus, this team, I have to give credit to Tortorella, because this team has been deprived of so much talent, and yet their record is almost as good as the Leafs, and they just have this fight back that a lot of teams just don't have. They're really well coached, and they just play really hard. I just got to give it to the Blue Jackets. They're not the most talented team, but they definitely hang around, and they're the type of team that could scare a team like Toronto, I think. I'm wondering what the Blue Jackets are going to do at goalie, because Merzlikins in 33 games did have a .923 save percentage. pretty darn good. He was really good for them, and he kind of sent them on a run before the season stopped. Jonas Korpisalo was doing all right before Merzlikins came in. I think Columbus just has really good defensive zone organization, so whoever ends up playing goalie is going to have it a little bit easier. I think both of those guys' numbers, Merzlikins and Korpisalo, are a little bit inflated because this team is just so well organized in their own zone. Columbus is a tough team. I'm going to favor Toronto. I think I'd be a little bit surprised if Toronto didn't win, and obviously it'd be quite a disappointment for that fan base if they didn't win, but I think the Leafs have enough to pull this one out. So next up, we've got Carolina against the New York Rangers. So this is the first series where I actually think that there's a betting edge. Carolina is favored. I see them at -145. The Rangers at +120, I think, is the move in this series. But before I get into that, I would like to give Carolina credit because I think that Don Waddell and this Carolina front office is actually one of the smartest in the NHL. This team has done a really good job of maintaining cap space, taking in a couple bad contracts for draft picks while keeping a really talented team together. They're good at trading players before they have to overpay them, specifically Jeff Skinner and Justin Falk. And they get future assets for those players, which they can in turn use and continue developing what has been a really successful AHL team. For a long time, this Hurricanes team had goalie issues. Cam Ward was pretty terrible. Darling was just, a nightmare for this team. Eventually, the Hurricanes figured out that they could improve their goaltending by getting a capable goalie, not overpaying for him, but improving the defense around that goalie. So they ended up going with Peter Mrazek and just getting a ton of good defensemen around him. If you look at this team's decor, it's just loaded. They are injured right now. I don't think Pesce or Dougie Hamilton are going to play in this tournament, which, that's two of their three best defensemen. But even without those guys, they still have Jacob Slavin, newly acquired Sami Vatanen at the trade deadline, newly acquired Brady Shea, Joel Edmondson, Jake Gardner, Hayden Fleury, Trevor Van Riemsdyk. They've got a lot of guys who can play defense. I think this team is going to be good for a long time. I really like some of their offensive players. They've got some real star players in the making. Sebastian Aho, Teuvo Teravainen has been excellent very quietly. And Andrei Svechnikov took a really big step from year one to year two. He looks like he's going to be a really good player in the NHL. They've got really good forward depth. And I just like the way this team has been constructed. With all of that being said, I'm favoring the Rangers in this series in what appears to be an upset according to most betting sites. Rangers +120 or anything like even close to even money, I would actually say is a positive expected value bet. The reason why, before the season stopped, the Rangers were 4-0 against the Hurricanes. All of those wins were in regulation. In those 4 games, the Rangers outscored the Hurricanes 17-9. You look at each of these teams' depth charts. I don't know if the Rangers are substantially better than the Hurricanes, but it's one of those things where if you just struggle with one team, it can kind of haunt you in a situation like this. In a 5-game series, I wouldn't be shocked if the Hurricanes won, but to be 4-0 is, pretty impressive. I think that it's worth something. I definitely don't think that this 4-0 record is trivial. Going over some of the Rangers' star players, this team is very top-heavy. They're not as depth-filled as Carolina is. Artemi Panarin, you could make the argument, is one of the 5 best players in the world right now. He had 95 points in only 69 games in the regular season, a 1.38 points per game, which was near the top of the league. Plus 36 plus-minus rating. Artemi Panarin has blossomed into a real stud. Same is true with Mika Zibanejad, 75 points in 57 games, a 1.32 points per game. Ryan Strome is having a really good year playing with those guys at times. before the season stopped, and they've found a couple of really good offensive defensemen. Tony DeAngelo and Adam Fox specifically have been really nice additions for this blue line. And to top it all off, the Rangers actually have 3 pretty good goalies at this point. Alexander Georgiev, Henrik Lundqvist, and Igor Shesterkin. All 3 of those guys were playing pretty well, and I actually would trust any of those 3 guys to play well enough to win in a 5-game play-in tournament. So the Rangers, their lack of depth is a little bit concerning, but I'm going to stick to them being a good matchup against the Hurricanes, and I think Rangers plus 120 would be the move. All right, and finally we've got the Islanders and the Panthers as the final play-in tournament in the Eastern Conference. So on most betting sites, this is almost a dead even split where no one is favored. It's really just, almost like a pick'em in, a singular game. If you can get the Islanders at around even money, I think that they should be slightly favored, and in most places they're not. The Islanders and Panthers played 3 times in the regular season before the season stopped. The Islanders won all 3 of those meetings. 2 of the 3 wins were in regulation. In those 3 games, the Islanders outscored the Panthers 8-4. And so, this is kind of a tricky series because you've got Barry Trotz and Lou Lamoriello on the Islanders side, where it's one of the best head coach GM combinations. But then on the flip side, Florida's got Joel Quenneville now, also, one of the best coaches in the NHL. So there's no coaching advantage, you could really say. The Islanders are very defensive oriented. They're very disciplined, solid. The Panthers, much more offensive oriented. You look at the Panthers' best players, it's Barkov, Huberdeau, Dadonov, Hoffman. They've got all these really good forwards. The Islanders are more of a solid, kind of a tougher, more disciplined, depth-filled team. The only thing that kind of makes me nervous about this series, if you were to bet against the Panthers, is that Sergei Bobrovsky is someone who is talented enough to wake up at any time and steal a 5-game series like this. In 50 games in this past regular season, he only had a .900 save percentage. He was having one of those really low Bobrovsky performances. But if he were to just wake up and play really well, it wouldn't shock me. We've seen him do that in the past. Columbus has, done well in regular seasons with Bobrovsky as their starter. Now he's with Florida. Did not get off to the greatest start this past season, but, it wouldn't shock me for Bobrovsky to be pretty good in this series. On the flip side, the Islanders roll with Semyon Varlamov and Thomas Greiss. It's a good combination. I don't actually know which one is going to be the starter right away, but, I'm going to side with the Islanders a little bit. I think their defensive mindset is going to help them out in a series like this, but if Bobrovsky just stood on his head for one 5-game stretch, it wouldn't surprise me that much, and I think this series will be close. If you can get the Islanders at plus money, makes a ton of sense. Even at even money, I think that the Islanders would be, the right move there. I think they should be slightly favored because of how the regular season head-to-head went, but this is going to be a good series, and I'm not super confident in saying that the Islanders should be favored. So moving to the Western Conference, starting out with the Blackhawks and Oilers. Honestly, this is one of the series that I feel the least confident about of all the play-in series about how it's going to finish. So, I'll start out with the Blackhawks. It's kind of interesting because the bare bones of their Stanley Cup core are actually still remaining. You've got Kane and Taves. Duncan Keith is definitely a worse player than he was like 4 years ago, but he's not bad. Corey Crawford is someone who's battled a lot of injuries since their last Stanley Cup, and he definitely has taken a little bit of a hit with his game because of all the injuries. It just kind of feels like this series, from the Oilers' perspective, could be kind of a trap because of the Blackhawks' experience in huge games in the past. And if you look at the Oilers, they've struggled to consistently play well in the McDavid era so far. It's obviously not McDavid's fault, but, this team has some flaws to it. It's just about which team's flaws are going to be more exposed in a 5-game series, and it's a really tough thing to predict. On the Blackhawks side, I think this team is really poor defensively. It's one of the worst defensive teams in the league. I don't think the coaching has been very good ever since they lost Quenneville. I think this team has been poorly coached. So, as I already mentioned, Duncan Keith has regressed a little bit. Brent Seabrook is actually borderline unplayable. I think he's a bottom pair defenseman at best right now. Oli Mata and Connor Murphy have been a little bit disappointing. Calvin DeHaan, one of their more solid defensemen, is actually going to be out for this series, most likely. So, there are some issues. On the flip side, you can look at the Blackhawks and say that they do have actually kind of a nice young core of players. DeBrincat, Dylan Strome, Kubalik, who was a really nice addition this year, Adam Boquist, who started playing before the season stopped for the Blackhawks team rather than the AHL, Kirby Dach, 3rd overall pick from this past draft, actually got a lot of regular season action. And then, Alex Nylander, I don't know if he belongs in the same category as the rest of those guys because he's struggled, but he is a talented young player who could potentially make an impact down the road. I think if they added the 1st overall pick, this team would be pretty amazing actually offensively. I think, it would be a really good addition for Lafreniere to go to a team like Chicago. So the Blackhawks are pretty offensive oriented. I think that defensively they're problematic. I also really hated the Robin Lehner trade at the time of the trade. I think Stan Bowman's done a good job keeping this team together for so long, but I thought this trade was pretty indefensible. Malcolm Subban has just been bad. Malcolm Subban is one of the pieces they got back in this trade from Vegas. Malcolm Subban has been the weak link of the Vegas Golden Knights since they expanded. Subban has had a terrible save percentage his entire time with the Golden Knights, his entire career. I think that there's several KHL goalies that are probably better than Subban. I think there's a lot of AHL goalies better than him. I think he's just an AHL starter at this point. They got a 2nd-round pick and a defensive prospect, Slava Demin, who's not bad, but I just thought, all in all, I don't think they really got enough for Robin Lehner. I thought that was a good deal for the Golden Knights, and I'll talk about them later, but I think that they've got a really good tandem of goalies now. Corey Crawford hasn't been terrible this past season, but he's a little bit frail. You wonder about him. With the injuries. So overall, I think the Blackhawks have some intrigue to them, but they were the 12 seed for a reason. So I kind of go back and forth on whether or not this team that's been so clutch and has had so many brilliant moments in the past, with a lot of other supporting cast players around them, can pull off one more really interesting playoff moment. Going over Edmonton, I have to ask this question, and I'm not even sure what my answer is to the question, but is Peter Chiarelli a little bit underrated considering how well this team actually performed this past year? Because Chiarelli actually got Draisaitl under a pretty good contract, considering that Draisaitl might be the 2nd best player in the world now, right there with Connor McDavid. Kyler Yamamoto, also a player who really blossomed before the season stopped. The Oilers are really top-heavy still, and by the way, I think Chiarelli made plenty of mistakes. You can go over tons of other moves that were not up to par. I just think he might be a little bit underrated, not necessarily a great GM. The Oilers don't have a ton of forward depth. They rely very heavily on those top 2 guys, McDavid and Draisaitl, maybe the 2 best players in the world right now. Defensively, they've got some guys, Darnell Nurse and Oscar Klefbom have been pretty good, so they've found a top pairing of guys they've got some other pieces there. The defensive depth isn't as bad as the forward depth. The biggest problem with the Oilers is that I just don't trust Mikko Koskinen or Mike Smith very much. Mike Smith has been bad. I think Koskinen is probably the better of those two goalies right now. But I don't know. I just think for a 5-game series, if one of those two guys just let you down, or if both guys just let you down for that 5-game stretch, it wouldn't shock me. And so there's an argument to be made that Crawford at this moment is actually the best goalie in this series. The other thing that gives me a little bit of cause for concern is that the Blackhawks were actually 2-1 against the Oilers this year before the season stopped. Oilers 1-2 against Chicago. I feel really uncertain about this series. I'm excited for it though. I think it'll be a fun series to watch. These are two of the most offensive teams in the league, and I think it'll be kind of a fun series, more offense than defense, and so I'll be excited to watch it. I definitely wouldn't bet on either side just because of the uncertainty around both teams, but I think this is a potential trap for the Oilers, and I'll be curious to see what the Blackhawks look like in a series like this. Next up, we've got the Arizona Coyotes and Nashville Predators. So in the regular season, before the season stopped, each of these teams was 1-1 against the other, so not a lot to read into with the regular season series. The Predators are favored on most betting sites, and this is one of the few series here where I see a pretty good betting advantage. The Coyotes on the site that I looked at were plus 116. I like the Coyotes at plus money. I think the Arizona Coyotes are the team you should bet on. I think they're going to win this play-in tournament. I think that this team is better than Nashville right now. So I really like John Chayka. I think he's done a really good job building this team. I think he's one of the most underrated general managers, and I just think people forget how bad this team was when he took over and how competent they are right now. Just going over their defensemen, which I think this is a really solid decor. They've got Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Alex Goligoski, Jacob Chychrun, Nicholas Hjalmarsson, Jordan Osterley, Jason Demers, and Lyubushkin. I think this team is really solid defensively. If you look at the goaltending discrepancy between Nashville and Arizona, it's remarkable. The Coyotes were in first place before Darcy Kemper got injured. First place in the Pacific, not in the conference. Darcy Kemper in 29 games had a .928 save percentage, and Antti Ranta, in relief of him in 33 games, had a .921 save percentage. They've got a really good pair of goalies. I think that both Kemper and Ranta were playing way better than either of the goalies in Nashville. If you look at Nashville's goaltending situation, they've actually got maybe a controversy on their hands because Pekka Rinne in 36 games, only an .895 save percentage. He's really fallen off the past 12 months. He's 37 years old. UC Saros is a guy who I've liked for a while. In 40 games before the season stopped, he had a .914 save percentage, quite a bit better. I'm wondering if the Predators just go with Saros over Rinne. I think either way, I'm going to favor the Coyotes heavily with the goaltending. I think that part of the reason why the Coyotes goaltending is so good is because their defense is really good. It's kind of a smart way to go about it, I think, is to help your goaltending by improving your defensemen. Instead of investing $10 million in a guy like Carey Price, just invest in some better third and fourth defensemen, pay a cheaper goalie, and then let that goalie play better in your system. So the issue with Arizona is that they're a little bit offensively limited, but I actually really like their depth. I think that their third line is about as good as their second line, so I think they have a lot of interchangeable parts. And even though this team has struggled with scoring, they do have Taylor Hall, Phil Kessel, Clayton Keller, and Nick Schmaltz. I think that they actually have the potential to be a good offensive team. They just haven't shown it yet. Kessel is having a down year. Keller and Schmaltz are good pieces. Neither one has blossomed into like a real star player. I think that they're both close. And look, Taylor Hall, you got to think that that guy's going to be hungry to play in a 5-game series like this. Like, he's going to be itching to get back into the playoffs. And just going over Nashville again, you know, they've had some tough playoff losses the past couple of years. They've been on kind of a downward spiral, you know, since they went to the Stanley Cup Finals a few years ago. They've just moved backwards, I think. Quietly, this D-core isn't as good as it used to be. Roman Josi might be the best defenseman in the league. You know, he's got a case for it. He's certainly in the top, 3, I would say. After that, though, you know, it's Ryan Ellis, who's really good, and Matthias Ekholm, who's solid. But after that, you've got, you know, maybe less depth than Arizona has. And so I think Arizona at plus 116, this Coyotes team, I just think they remind me of a team that would win a play-in series like this. They look like kind of a team that's more built for the playoffs than the regular season. I think this team has been built pretty intelligently by Chayka, and I think that Nashville just looks inferior, especially in the goaltending department. So I'm going to lean with Arizona here. It's a little bit of an upset. I think the Coyotes pull this one out. All right, next up we've got Vancouver and Minnesota. This is a series that I would probably say is hands down the one that I feel the least confident predicting. I don't even know. I'm just going to admit I don't know who's going to win this in a 5-game series here. If you can get Minnesota at really good plus money, I think it actually makes sense. Vancouver is favored almost everywhere. The Canucks are a good team. They've actually built up some depth. I think Markstrom's been a pretty good goalie. The issue with Vancouver relative to Minnesota is just the lack of experience in big games. This team has been bad for a while now, and the Canucks' best players are very young and inexperienced. Elias Pettersson and Quinn Hughes are, you know, most notably their 2 best guys. They also have some good players like Horvat. The issue is just the experience. Now, look, maybe it won't matter at all, and the Canucks will be fine in this tournament. This 5-game play-in tournament will be fine for them, and they'll just look really good. On the flip side, you've got the Minnesota Wild here. So the biggest problem with the Wild, I think, is that Dubnyk was really struggling in this past season. He had an .891 save percentage in 30 games. Stalock was playing a little bit better, Alex Stalock, their backup goalie. I just think the Wild have an issue with their goaltending. You know, if you look at Minnesota's depth chart, I think their top 4 defensemen are fine. I think the Wild have a good enough top 6 at forward. I think that, they're an okay team, but the goaltending really let them down this year in particular. In the regular season series between these two teams, the Wild actually went 2-1 against Vancouver. One of those Minnesota victories was in overtime, so the Canucks were 1-1 against Minnesota. You know, it's a little bit of a cause for concern. I think that Dubnyk is either just done as a starting goalie in the league, or maybe he has one final 5-game stretch within him where he can, you know, outperform a guy like Jacob Markstrom for 5 games. It wouldn't shock me. I just think this series is one that you probably don't want to bet on unless Minnesota is a huge, heavy underdog, in which case I think that there's maybe a slight advantage to going with the Wild. I think that, you know, top to bottom, Vancouver is a better team right now. It's just a matter of whether or not their experience or lack of experience holds them back in a series like this. All right, now we have the final 5-game play-in series between Calgary and Winnipeg. So interestingly, these two teams only got to play each other once before the season stopped. Winnipeg won that matchup beyond regulation, so Calgary 0-0-1 against the Jets. Calgary is favored in this series against Winnipeg. I think if you can get Winnipeg at plus money, I think that would be the better play. Just going over Calgary, and look, I think this series is going to be a close one, but The Flames have had some really embarrassing playoff losses in basically the era of this Goudreau, Monahan, Giordano, Brody, Hamonic core. I think it was 3 years ago they were swept by the Ducks in the first round and just looked completely outmatched. Then they didn't make the playoffs. And then last year, in what was kind of a strange season where the Western Conference was just really weak relative to the Eastern Conference, the Flames were actually the number 1 seed, and they were just thoroughly beaten by the Avalanche in the first round in 5 games. You know, they do have some new guys. Elias Lindholm has been a good addition for them. Matthew Tkachuk has emerged as a really good player. And they also added Noah Hanifin, who I think is a good, slightly underrated defenseman. I don't think this Flames team is bad, but I'm a little bit worried about them being favored in a 5-game play-in like this, especially when they've got Riddick and Cam Talbot as their goalies, because I don't trust either one of those guys in a series like this. On the other hand, we have the Winnipeg Jets. You know, they're not as good of a roster as they've been in the past couple of seasons, but 2 years ago, they pretty impressively won 2 series and then lost to Vegas in the Western Conference Finals. Last year, they lost in 6 games to the Blues in the first round, but of course the Blues ended up winning the Stanley Cup. I think this team has been pretty good in the playoffs. I think they've had pretty good playoff success. I just trust the Jets' core group of players a lot more than Calgary's. Mark Scheifele, Kyle Connor, Blake Wheeler, Nikolai Ehlers, Patrick Laine, who is someone that I think has weirdly become a little bit undervalued. Laine is the type of guy who could come into a series like this cold and just score like 5 goals in 2 games. And it's like, wow, that guy just came back and helped the series shift in the Jets' favor. I think Cody Eakin was a good addition. And even though this Jets team lost Dustin Byfuglien, I think they've been really resilient, and they've actually been really well coached, and I think they've done a good job. A couple defensemen who have stuck out this season, Neil Pionk, the addition from the Trouba trade, has been really good for the Jets. And Josh Morrissey, very quietly, top pairing type of defenseman. So I like this team a lot. And then just going to the goaltending, Connor Hellebuck in 58 games this year had a .922 save percentage. I think Hellebuck is a lot better than either of the goalies in Calgary. I just like the Jets better as a team. I think that they're more built for playoff hockey at this point, and they've got a better track record. So I would favor the Jets in this series, and the fact that Calgary is favored everywhere that I looked is surprising, and I would bet on Winnipeg if you can get them at plus money. All right, so now I'm going to do a quick preview of each of the 4 top seeds in each conference. So starting with the Eastern Conference, the Boston Bruins had 100 points in 70 games when the season stopped. They were on pace for 117 points. Going over some of the head-to-head matchups, the Bruins in this past season were 1-0-2 against the Flyers. They were 1-1-1 against the Capitals, and they were 1-2-1 against the Lightning. So considering how good their record was, I think the Bruins, it is a fair question to wonder, why was their record so poor against the 3 other best teams in the Eastern Conference by record when the season stopped? I think it's a little bit of a concern. I still think this team has a fair case at going back to the Stanley Cup Finals. Just looking at their team, I think their top line is absolutely filthy. Pasternak has been unbelievable. Marchand has really blossomed into a star player. Bergeron is still really solid. The D-core is still good. Charlie McAvoy specifically has developed really well into a good player. Tuukka Rask is really solid. I think the rest probably helps Boston more than most teams as well, just because this team went to a 7th game in the Stanley Cup Finals last year and they lost. Probably pretty demoralizing, but with all the rest, I think this team could be a little bit rejuvenated relative to what they would have been if the season had just kept going. So I think the Bruins have a fair shot at going to the Stanley Cup Finals. The Tampa Bay Lightning finished second in the Eastern Conference, 92 points in 70 games. When the season stopped, they were on pace for 108 points. Tampa Bay was 3-1 against Boston, 2-0 against Philadelphia, but 0-2-1 against Washington. So kind of an interesting split there. They struggled with Washington, did really well against Boston and Philadelphia. I do really like this Tampa Bay Lightning team. I've been picking them to go really far for quite a while now. There's been some disappointments along the way, but this team does have a loaded roster. Just looking at their offensive players, Nikita Kucherov, Steven Stamkos, Braden Point, as their top three scoring players is pretty remarkable. They've had really good contributions from some of their secondary scorers. Anthony Cirelli has been a really good, speedy scoring type center for like their third line. Alexander Killorn has been a good secondary scorer. Andre Palat quietly is still a pretty good player. Tyler Johnson, another guy that they can still rely on. Their D-core is also quite good. Victor Hedman, pretty clearly an elite defenseman. McDonough has taken a step back, not as good as he was probably 3-4 years ago, but they've gotten good contributions from Mikhail Sergachev and Kevin Shattenkirk. Both guys are kind of offensive defensemen, but they fit in well with that Tampa Bay roster. And Andrei Vasilevsky, you could make the argument that he's one of the 5 best goalies in the world right now. So this Tampa Bay roster is still loaded. I think that a lot of the reason why people fell in love with this team last year should be carried over to this year, even though this team had a really disappointing playoff exit last year. I think Tampa Bay undoubtedly is still in contention for being in the Stanley Cup Finals this year, despite their playoff failures. The third team in the Eastern Conference was Washington. They had 90 points in 69 games. They were on pace for 107 points. The Capitals went 2-1 against the Bruins. They were 1-3 against the Flyers, but 3-0 against the Lightning in the regular season before it stopped. The Capitals have had some interesting splits as well. It seems that they're a little bit matchup dependent, but we'll see how it plays out. I still like this Capitals team quite a bit. They're pretty loaded offensively. I think Kuznetsov is outstanding. Ovechkin continues to be a great goal scorer. Nicholas Backstrom, Jacob Vrana, TJ Oshie, Tom Wilson. Lars Eller is a really good third center to have. John Carlson has been an amazing defenseman. He has a case to be the best defenseman in the NHL as well. He would certainly be in my top 5. Despite Carlson being as amazing as he is, I will say that the Capitals' D-core is a little bit thinner than it has been in a couple of the years prior to this. Certainly a little bit thinner than their Stanley Cup year. And the Capitals also have an interesting goalie situation happening. Braden Holtby, longtime Capitals starter, 48 games played this year, only an .898 save percentage when the season stopped. He really fell off this season. Ilya Samsonov is the goalie that's been waiting in the wings for a while now. He previously was playing in Magnitogorsk in the KHL. He's come over this season, 26 games played. For Samsonov, a .913 save percentage, only 22 years old. So my bold prediction is that the Capitals end up riding with Samsonov for more playoff games than Holtby in this upcoming playoff tournament. The Capitals have done this before. In fact, Holtby earned his starting job by being a young, unproven goalie and winning the starting job in a playoff series, and they did a similar thing with Varlamov several years before that, where a young goalie emerges for this Capitals team and kind of starts out by playing in the playoffs. I think it would be more likely that the Capitals end up as a team that wins maybe one playoff series and loses in the second round, rather than, going all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals. Because I think with this kind of goalie uncertainty, you're probably not riding this unproven of a goalie in Samsonov all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals. But I think this Capitals team is talented enough to the point where I could see them winning definitely 1, maybe even 2 playoff series before they get eliminated. So I think the Capitals are more of a second round exit type team, if I had to guess, but I think that they are super talented, and I wouldn't put it past them to be really good. And maybe Holtby can come back and play really well. I would say Samsonov, for me right now, is the best goalie on this team's roster. Finally, we have the Philadelphia Flyers, kind of the wild card team of the top 4 in the East. They had 89 points in 69 games. They are on pace for about 106 points. Despite being the 4th team in the Eastern Conference standings, this team actually played really well against 2 of the teams ranked in front of them. They were 2-1-0 against the Bruins, and they were 3-0-1 against the Capitals. They were 0-2 against the Tampa Bay Lightning, however. So I think this team has a bright future. They were really cooking before this season stopped. I think Philadelphia was probably the hottest team in the league when the season stopped. They seem to be a good team. They weirdly played better against better teams, which I think is kind of an interesting quality. Chuck Fletcher is their new general manager. I think he did a really good job this past offseason of kind of, bringing in some good pieces. I thought the Niskanen and Braun additions kind of helped this team's defense a little bit. And I think this team just has better depth than they've had in a couple of the years prior to this one. Carter Hart is their goalie. He's only 21 years old, which is why I think this team has a really bright future. In 43 games, he had a .914 save percentage. I think the Flyers are going to be a good team down the road. I think this year they're going to be a frisky team that maybe wins a series, maybe they don't. This will be good for Carter Hart to kind of get his feet wet and get some playoff experience for himself. So when the regular season stopped, the Blues were the team in first place in the Western Conference. They had 94 points in 71 games. They were on pace for about 108.5. So the Blues were 2-2-0 against the Avalanche this season before it stopped. They were 4-0-1 against the Dallas Stars, and they were 1-0-2 against the Vegas Golden Knights. Kind of a mixed set of results against those 3 other top 4 teams in the Western Conference. I think this Blues team is really solid. I think that there's enough there offensively for them to be really good. And I think this Blues team has one of the best groups of defensemen in the NHL. Alex Pietrangelo, really solid, #1 defenseman. Colton Parayko has been really solid for them. Vince Dunn has been really good, actually. He's been a really nice developmental player who has gotten better along the way. They added Justin Falk. Jay Bouwmeester and Carl Gunnarsson are 2 pretty reliable guys to have on your third pair. And they also have Marco Scandella and Robert Bortuzzo as extra defensemen. So this team really solid defensively. I also trust Jordan Binnington. I think Binnington's really good. I would say tentatively he's one of the 10 best goalies in the NHL right now. And I think the Blues are definitely still a threat to win the Stanley Cup this year. Just behind the Blues, the Colorado Avalanche had 92 points in 70 games, on pace for about 108 points this year. So the Avalanche have some interesting splits. They were 2-0 against Vegas, but they were 0-2-2 against the Dallas Stars, 2-2 against the Blues. So Colorado struggled more with Dallas, did well against Vegas in only 2 meetings. Kind of an interesting split that the Avalanche have. This Avalanche team is pretty interesting. I think that they're a little bit top heavy as well. Their top line, you could make the argument, is one of the best in the NHL. Nathan MacKinnon is just absolutely unreal. Nathan MacKinnon, I would say, is pushing for being the best player in the world right now. He's right there with McDavid, Draisaitl, Panarin, Kucherov. He's right there with those guys. Cale Makar was kind of the wild card piece that ended up hitting this year. Cale Makar is unbelievable already at such a young age. I think he's only 21 years old, or he was when the season was going on. The Avalanche for a while now have needed that #1 defenseman to step in, and I was really surprised that it ended up being Cale Makar this quickly. He's been tremendous this year. Really good, offensively gifted defenseman. It looks like he's going to be an elite player for a long time. And the Avalanche have also added a lot of new pieces to this particular season's Avalanche team. They've had some playoff success in the past. Last year, they had a pretty nice upset victory against Calgary in the first round. They looked really good in that second round series against San Jose, just didn't quite win it. But they have a bunch of new pieces this year. Nazem Kadri, Andrei Burakovsky, who has this beautiful shot. He had 45 points in 58 games. Really offensively gifted player, Burakovsky. Valeri Nichushkin has resurrected his career as a really good penalty killer and a much better defensive forward. He was a really good contributor before the season stopped. They also added Vladislav Nemestikov, who could be a good, speedy, third-line type of winger, and Jonas Donskoy, who has some skill. I think the question is whether or not you believe in the Colorado goaltending, because I think the Avalanche have the talent to go the distance this year. Just looking at the Avalanche goaltending, Philip Grubauer, in 36 games played this year, had a .916 save percentage, and the backup goalie Pavel Francouz, in 34 games played, had a .923 save percentage. This Avalanche team has two pretty good goalies, I think, legitimately, because I don't think this team is unbelievably gifted defensively. I don't think they have the best defensive depth, but I think they're pretty well coached. I think they have two pretty talented goalies, and of course, offensively, they've got 3 full lines of players who can contribute to scoring, including maybe the best line in the NHL. So this Avalanche team has a ton of firepower. I think that they are one of the most interesting teams to look out for going into this NHL playoff tournament. In third place in the Western Conference before the season stopped, the Vegas Golden Knights, 86 points in 71 games played. They're on pace for about 99.5 points. Vegas was 0-2 against the Avalanche, 1-1 against the Dallas Stars, and 2-1 against the Blues before the season stopped. Interestingly, the Golden Knights didn't get as many games, maybe, as some of the other teams got against the other top 3 teams in the Western Conference. I really like this Golden Knights team. They got off to kind of the shaky start, a little bit slow, and then they made the really strange decision to fire Gallant partway through the season and actually go with Peter DeBoer, the coach who was previously coaching the San Jose Sharks during all of these crazy rivalries between Vegas and San Jose. So it was kind of interesting to hire that particular coach, even though I think Gallant and DeBoer are both, really good coaches. Just kind of an interesting decision, weird way to start the year. Vegas, though, down the stretch was playing really well, and I think some of their later season additions really helped boost this team. Looking at the Golden Knights' top 6 of forwards, they've got tons of players that I like. Mark Stone, William Karlsson, Jonathan Marchessault, Paul Stastny, Max Pacioretty, Riley Smith. Even guys in their bottom 6 who can play in the top 6, Chandler Stevenson and Alex Tuck, I think are really good depth players to have. I'm still looking out for Cody Glass, who I think is going to end up being a really good player at some point in the NHL. And then going over this team defensively, I think Shea Theodore is fantastic. I think Nate Schmidt is a really good puck mover, really good skater. Alec Martinez was a really solid but smart addition by this team, and he really helped, bring this team up a level when he was added prior to the trade deadline. They also have some good depth defensemen. Braden McNabb has been solid there for a while. John Merrill, Nick Holden, both pretty good players. And then the goaltending. Marc-Andre Fleury and Robin Leonard. I think the Leonard trade was really good for this Golden Knights team. If you look at Marc-Andre Fleury, as much as I love Marc-Andre Fleury, his save percentages in each of the 3 seasons he's been the Golden Knights starter have gone down. He has only gotten older, of course, in that time. I still think he could be the starter on this team, but to bring in Leonard as an insurance policy is fantastic. I think that Fleury and Leonard are 2 of the best 15 goalies in the NHL right now. And Robin Leonard just very quietly performs really well wherever he's gone. Even on some of those really bad Buffalo teams, he was really good. He put up good save percentages. I was really surprised the Blackhawks traded him, And I think this was a tremendous addition for the Vegas Golden Knights. I think if you're in like a game 5 or something of the Western Conference Finals and one of these two guys is struggling, you feel pretty confident that the other guy can step in and save your season. So I think this Golden Knights team has tons of depth. I really like some of the interesting pieces they've got all over the place. I think the Golden Knights are definitely a threat to win the Western Conference this year. All right, the fourth team in the Western Conference, the Dallas Stars. This team barely snuck into the top 4 over Edmonton. 82 points in 69 games, 97.5 points was what they were on pace for. So Dallas has some pretty interesting head-to-head records. They went 4-0 against the Colorado Avalanche, which is pretty impressive. I think that is something to look out for. If the Avalanche and Stars are matched up, that could be a trap series for the Avalanche. The Stars were 1-3-1 against the Blues, so not nearly as successful, but they were actually 1-0-1 against Vegas, so Dallas has held their own against some of the better teams. It's interesting because the Stars got off to that really poor start. They fired their coach. Tyler Seguin, Jamie Benn, and Alexander Radulov have all kind of had a bit of a down year. Specifically, Benn and Radulov have fallen off more than Seguin has, but this team is no longer as offensive oriented as they were, a few years ago. They're overall just kind of a solid team. I think the Bishop and Khudobin combination is a good one. I think it's a good tandem. I think Bishop, you could make the argument he's a top 10 goalie right now. Khudobin is one of the best backups, I think. And so I think this Dallas team has kind of a ceiling of maybe, winning a couple series. I think, if they were able to make 1 or 2 upsets, it would be a pleasant surprise. I think most likely the Stars probably win 1 series and then lose in the second round. But, they do have a lot of solid pieces. This team is pretty good across the board. I just like some of the other teams in the Western Conference a little bit better than them. Okay, so now just going over some Stanley Cup Finals predictions for me, and going over some betting angles to look at. I think to start in the Eastern Conference, right now the Tampa Bay Lightning are plus 250 to win the Eastern Conference, and the Bruins are plus 300. I think if you bet on both of those teams, you end up making money if one of them ends up representing the Eastern Conference, and I think that those are the 2 best teams in the East right now. I think that Washington, with the goaltending dilemma, might be slightly too flawed to end up going all the way. And I think Pittsburgh, with their own goaltending dilemma and having to play an extra play-in series, kind of limits what their potential is. So overall, I'd be pretty surprised if it wasn't Tampa Bay or Boston. But of course, it's the NHL playoffs, so you got to be prepared for anything. But, I think those are the 2 best teams in the East, and the fact that you can make money with betting on both of them is, I think, a positive deal to make. So for the Western Conference, I was pretty lucky. Back very early in the regular season, I was able to get St. Louis plus 400 to win the West, Colorado plus 410 to win the West, and Vegas plus 550 to win the West, back when Vegas was kind of on a shaky start. So I've got a ticket on all 3 of those teams. So if one of those teams ends up winning the West, I end up making money. Currently, Vegas is plus 250 and actually the favorite to come out of the Western Conference. Colorado's at plus 300. St. Louis is at plus 400. I think if you wanted to bet on 2 of those teams, it would make a lot of sense. To me, Vegas should be included in any combination of the 2, just because I think that Vegas is the most well put together, experienced team with the best goaltending tandem going into this tournament. But between St. Louis and Colorado, I don't have a huge favorite. I think the Blues being, kind of a further underdog than the Avalanche are, kind of makes me feel like the Blues are a little bit better suited to be the bet that you make to hedge with Vegas. But yeah, the Western Conference right now I think comes down to those 3 teams. I'd be really surprised if it wasn't Vegas, Colorado, or St. Louis. So before the 2019-2020 regular season began, which feels like ages ago, my Stanley Cup final prediction was Tampa Bay over Vegas in 6 games. At the time of the NHL trade deadline, which also feels like quite a while ago, I stuck with the exact same prediction, Tampa Bay over Vegas in 6. And now here we are in July. It's July 21st, which unprecedented date to make another Stanley Cup final prediction. But I'm going to go with Tampa Bay over Vegas in 6 once again, tripling down on that particular prediction. I don't feel overwhelmingly confident about it because it's the NHL playoffs, and the NHL is probably the least predictable of all the major sports, which is also part of the reason why it's fun to watch. The head-to-head between Vegas and Tampa Bay this year was 1-1, so not a huge edge on either side. I'm going to favor Tampa Bay slightly if that matchup does occur. All right, so that's all for this episode of the Athletic Acuity Sports Podcast. Thanks for listening.